Hi, I'm Laura Richcreek with Laura's Voice, and this is Laura Reads Foxed Books. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 1. I am so glad you're here. For the inaugural season of Laura Reads Foxed Books, we're going to read The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock by Thomas Nelson Page and illustrated by Howard Chandler Christie. Original copyright 1897. This particular book, copyrighted in 1901. This book and its illustrations are in the public domain. I'll have more information about the author and illustrator of each book, so subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when I have new uploads. I'm eager, as I'm sure you are, to get into the book. Just a couple of notes. Firstly, a stock is a kind of tie or collar, like a cravat, worn mostly in the mid-19th century. This stands out for our main character when he first meets the old gentleman. Secondly, Tityrus is mentioned, and is a reference to the Roman poet Virgil's first eclogue, wherein the shepherd, Tityrus, sits peacefully under a beech tree, playing his pipe. That's all you need to know for the moment, but there will be more information in the future. Lastly, I'd like to dedicate Season 1 to my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Haslam, who wanted, when she learned I am a voice actor, to listen to a book I narrated. She listened on a platform where the books were free. I don't remember the name of it, but the books I narrated weren't on that platform. She has since passed away, and I just wish she could subscribe to this channel. So, this is for her. Thanks, Mrs. Haslam. Without further ado, let's begin The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock. To my daughters, Mina Field and Florence Field, my two most constant and indulgent readers. Preface. At the suggestion of friends who have expressed a wish to know more of the history of Elizabeth Dale than has been told, I have availed myself of the opportunity offered by the publication of this new edition of The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock, illustrated by Mr. Christie's gifted pencil, to enlarge the story. I hope those who have done me the honor to accept The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock and Elizabeth Dale among their friends will feel that I have tried to add to their history in more ways than one. It has been a grateful task, for the old section of that ancient town through which the old gentleman of the Blackstock moved gravely in the years when the lover's scarred beech shaded his tangled yard, and which Elizabeth Dale lighted with her presence, has quite passed away. Cinderella's coach comes along only in the fairy time of youth. T.N.P. Chapter 1. A Primeval Relic. He was one of my first acquaintances when I came up to town to live, for I met him almost immediately after I gave up my country identity and melted into the sea of the city, though I did not learn his name for some time afterwards, and therefore knew him, as I found many others did, simply as the old gentleman of the Blackstock. Why I spoke to him that summer morning on the shaded street I can readily understand, but why he spoke to me I did not know until long afterwards. I was lonely and homesick. I had not yet met anyone except my cousin, who had given me a place in his law office and was most kind to me, but was too busy a man to talk much, the 2 or 3 gentlemen all older than myself who had offices on our floor, and the few people who lived at the little private boarding-house in the old part of town where I had taken the tiny hall room on the 3rd floor and furnished it with dreams. All of these last 2 were older than I, and seemed so very much older. At 21, a few years make such a great difference. Moreover, all the young people of my own age whom I saw on the street appeared to know each other so well, just as I had known my friends in the country, and to be so entirely all-sufficient to each other, that it made me feel pushed out and shut off from all the rest of the world. So I remember that as I walked that morning down the shaded, quiet street with the old square houses on either side set back amid trees in their big yards, I had forgotten my dreams of the future, which had hitherto gilded my lone little room and peopled my quiet office, and was back among the overgrown fence rows and fields of my country home. It was then that I met for the first time the old gentleman of the Blackstock, and he spoke to me. Of course, then I spoke to him. I was ready to speak to anyone, would have spoken to anyone in the world. I had, indeed, not yet gotten over the strange feeling I had at not speaking to everyone I met, in accordance with the civil country custom which made passing anyone on the road without a bow a breach of manners. This was the way of it. I was strolling along the street that morning, looking at the old yards full of fine trees and shrubbery in a tangled and somewhat neglected state, which reminded me of the yard at home, and I had only half taken in the fact that just ahead of me, out of the largest and most tangled of the yards, surrounding perhaps the oldest and most retired house on the street, had come someone, an old gentleman who had paused just outside his broken gate, and turning half around, was now standing looking back at the trees behind him. I insensibly followed his eye and glanced up at the trees myself as I walked along. There were 3 or 4 big locusts, 2 wide-branching elms, and 1 beech, all large and very old, and the beech quite gigantic. It was, perhaps, the sole relic of the primeval forest which once had clad these hills, and some tawny Tityrus might well have blown his wild pipe beneath its spreading shade. At least it had known of other times far back, for on its massive trunk the scars stood thick, telling of gentler strifes long past, of which lovers had graved the histories deep in its hoary bark. The beech had a seat under it, and it was at this that the old gentleman's gaze seemed to be particularly directed. The trees, too, reminded me of the country. Everything did, and I suppose I must have had that in my face, for when I brought my gaze down to the ground again, I was only a few paces from the old gentleman at the gate, and when I glanced at him, I caught his eye. I looked away, glanced at him again, for there was something about him which was unusual, quite as unusual as that square of old houses and shady yards in a growing city, and he attracted me. He seemed just to fit in with them, and to be separated from the rest of the people I had seen, almost as separate as myself. So when I looked at him again, I tried to do it as if quite casually, and at the same time endeavored to take in as much of him as I could in my glance. The principal features which I noted were a tall, slender figure, neatly clad in the manner in which an old gentleman of his age should be clad, with a black broadcloth frock coat, somewhat, however, more flowing than usual, and a black stock up to the chin, with a high, white, unstarched collar falling over it, such as I remembered very old gentlemen used to wear years before, when I was a child, but such as I had not seen for some time. This was all that I took in of his dress, for I caught his eye again as my glance reached his thin, high-bred, and somewhat careworn face, clean-shaven except for a white, carefully trimmed mustache. His eyes were gray and keen, and were set back very deep under somewhat heavy brows, and I looked into them involuntarily. He did not give me time to look away again, but spoke to me. "Good morning, sir," easily, pleasantly, quite so much indeed as if he had known me, that it flashed across my mind in the half-second which passed before I returned his salutation that he had mistaken me for someone else. I replied, however, "Good morning, sir," and as a sort of apology for my stare, said, "You have some fine old trees there, sir," and was passing on with a somewhat quickened step when he said, "Yes, sir, they were very fine once, and would be so now if they could escape the universal curse of age. You are fond of trees?" he added, as I paused to avoid the rudeness of leaving him while he was speaking. "Yes, sir, I was brought up amongst them." I was going on to say that they carried me back to my home, but he did not give me time. "They are worth loving. They last. How long have you been from the country?" His deep eyes were resting on my face. I was a little taken aback, for, apart from the fact that his abrupt question implied that he knew at a glance I was not a city man, I was sufficiently conscious of a certain difference between myself and the smooth young city fellows I met, to think that he meant to remark on my countrified appearance. So, with a half-formed idea that he might, if given the opportunity, explain himself differently, I simply replied, "Sir?" "How long have you been in the city?" "Oh, about 3 weeks," I said with assumed indifference, and still feeling a little uncomfortable over the meaning I assigned him, and gradually getting somewhat warm over it, I moved to go on. "Where are you from?" he asked. I told him the county. "Oh, I thought so." He scanned me so boldly and I fancied rudely that I said quite shortly, "Good morning, sir." He bowed. "Good morning, sir." It was only when I went over in my mind afterwards all the circumstances of the interview to see if I could find anything to soothe my wounded spirit that I recalled how gracious his manner was, and how courteous his tone as he returned my parting salute, and decided that he could not have meant to insult or wound me. I found that he had made quite an impression on me. His appearance, his voice, his air, all remained with me, distinguished from those of the men I was now meeting. I asked my cousin who he was, and attempted to describe him, but though I went into some detail and gave, I thought, a faithful portraiture of him, my cousin, who was a man about town as well as a lawyer in extensive practice, failed to recognize him from my description. In time I made acquaintances, and in further time yet I secured practice enough to justify me in selecting more commodious quarters than those I had at first in my little hall room. And as I fell into city ways, I began to visit about in society more and more, until I became quite as much of a city man, and indeed of a society man, as a still very modest income, coupled with some ambition to increase it, would allow. Yet I never met my old gentleman of the Blackstock in any of the bright houses I visited, or, indeed, anywhere else except on the street, and there only very rarely, perhaps 2 or 3 times at most in the 2 years which went by, before I ever did more than acknowledge with a bow his passing and pleasant salutation. End of Chapter 1. This has been The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock by Thomas Nelson Page, illustrated by Howard Chandler Christie. Production copyright 2025 by Laura Reeds Foxed Books. Thanks for being here. See you next week.